Hi, and welcome to Watch It Played. My name is Rodney Smith, and in this video we're going to learn the 2 to 4 player game Mountains Out of Molehills, designed by Jim DiCamillo and Pat Marino, and published by the Op, who helped sponsor this video. Once again, it's time for the annual Mountain Maker Tournament. But you know that because you're one of the champion moles who's traveled to compete and see if you can create and control the most mountains. So join me at the table, and let's learn how to play. To set up, first ensure you've taken all the pieces out of the box because we're going to be using it in the game by placing this brown double-sided underground board into it. This side has a 4x4 area used in 2-player games, while this side is for 3 and 4-player games. And in this video, we'll assume we have 3 players. Now find these 4 support pieces and notice that on one end, you'll find this triangular opening, and on the other, you have sort of what looks like a cap here. And you'll want to pay attention to this because we're going to start by placing this open end into one of the corners of the box. You then do this for the rest of the corners so that it looks like this. Now take this above ground board and place it on top. Now this is also double-sided, so ensure that it's flipped to the side matching the number of squares on the board below. You also want to make sure that it's rotated so that the orientation of the letters and numbers that we see on it match the orientation of the letters and numbers on the underground board as well. Now find the game's included cards and shuffle them into a face-down deck, setting this rock token and die nearby. Next, each player collects a mole figure and all of these molehill pieces in the same color as their figure's base. Now, when you first play, you'll find a protective film on one side of the moles and their bases, which you can peel off. These are the King of the Hill tokens, and you take number 1 up to the number of players you have, returning the rest to the box. So in our 3-player game, we'll collect tokens 1, 2, and 3. You mix these up and then randomly pass one to each player. These tokens will tell you the order that players will take their turns in. And starting with the first player and going in the numbered order, each person will add their mole to an unoccupied outside corner of the underground board. Now, I'll just point out, I've removed the top layer so the camera can see the board more easily, but you'll have no trouble seeing it while you're playing. In a 4-player game, this entire board is used, but in a 3-player game, as indicated by the marker in this corner, you only use the spaces that make up this 5x5 grid, treating the outer right and bottom row as if those spaces don't even exist. So when the first player adds their mole to one of the corners, they might place it here. And when placing your mole, also decide which way it's facing, which is determined by the direction its nose is pointing, and moles can face in any direction except diagonally. Then each other player in turn order also adds their mole to one of the open corners. Next, each player adds one of their molehill pieces to the above ground space directly above the space where their mole is on the underground board below. And as we saw, each of the boards have these same letter and number grids to help you match the spaces between them if needed. Finally, give this score pad to whoever most recently dug a hole. Or you can just pick someone randomly. And that's the setup. In Mountains Out of Molehills, players will dig tunnels underground that push the dirt above ground into towering mountains they can control and score. But if a mountain gets too high, it'll topple, which you can use to your advantage if you plan carefully. Each round, you'll gain points for the molehill pieces that you control, and if you have the most points by the end of the game, you'll win. The game is played over 6 rounds, and each round is broken into 3 parts, starting with card drafting. Here you deal 5 cards per player face up from this movement deck. So in our 3-player game, that means we deal a total of 15. Now starting with the first player and going in turn order, which remember is determined by the King of the Hill tokens that the players are holding. Each person will take turns picking one of the face-up movement cards and adding it to their hand. After taking a card, you can continue to look at it, but keep it hidden from the other players. And we'll see why you might want certain cards later. But after all of the players have collected their first card, everyone continues in turn order to take a second, and then a third, and fourth. Any leftover face-up movement cards on the table are now moved to a shared discard pile. And now we're ready to move on to the next step of the round, planning and movement. Here, all of the players will simultaneously and secretly organize the 4 movement cards they have into a face-down stack in front of themselves. The order they put their cards within the stack is the order they'll resolve them later, with the card on top being the first card they'll resolve, down to the last one on the bottom. And once you're done setting the order, show this by putting your King of the Hill token on top. You are not allowed to change or even look at the order of your cards from this point on. And once everyone has their stacks ready, it's time to resolve the movement part of this step. Here, the player with the number 1 King of the Hill token will reveal and resolve their topmost movement card. Movement cards have a variety of different symbols on them, so let's take a moment and learn how they work. If you reveal the movement card showing the rock, you collect this rock token from wherever it is and put it into any empty space of the underground board. Again, remembering that in a 3-player game, we treat this column and row as if it doesn't even exist. Now, after adding the rock, you then roll the die and set it on top of that token. And that's how you resolve the rock movement card. Not a lot of movement going on there, but a rock has now been placed. And with the rock here, it can interfere with things, as we'll see later. I should also mention, once the rock has been added to the board, if someone else reveals a rock card later, they simply pick up the token and put it in any space they want, re-rolling the die and setting it on top. All right, now let's look at some of the other cards. These, aside from the numbers on them, are all similar. When played, you move your mole directly forward as many spaces as the number showing on the bottom. So either 1, 2, or 3 spaces. When moving forward, you always go in the direction your mole is facing, which is based on where its nose is pointing. So moving this mole using this card would take it from the space it's in 1, 2, 3 spaces to here. Now you must always move the full distance showing on the card you've played if you can. However, your mole cannot move beyond the edges of the play area. So if I had started my turn here and had played this card, I would move 1 space and then stop, losing the other 2 points of movement. The same is true if you bump into another mole. Moles are polite and will always wait their turn. So if I was here and I played a move 2 card, I would move 1 space and stop, losing the rest of my move. This is also where the rock comes into play. So here, I'm moving 3 spaces forward. The first space would bring me to here. Now the second space would bump me into the rock, where instead, I spend that space of movement turning in the direction pictured on the die, which will show either a turn to the right, left, or a U-turn. Now in this case, it's showing a turn to the right, so I would rotate like this. Then if I have any spaces of movement left, I would continue. Now let's look at another card. If you reveal this one, it means you either turn your mole 90 degrees to the left or right. So if I was here, I could either turn this way or like this. Now, let's assume instead we were playing this card. It's a U-turn, which causes you to rotate your mole from the direction it's facing to the opposite direction. Here's 2 more cards. This one lets you turn left and move 1 space, while this one lets you turn right and move 1 space. The catch is that you can do the turn and move in either order. So if I had revealed this card, I could move 1 space and then turn, or I could have turned first and then moved 1 space. Now the order you do this is important because let's say instead I had been here and then played this card. I would lose my move if I resolved it first because I'm already at the edge of the board. So instead, I might choose to turn and then move. Now, while we're here, I want to point out another card you might play. This shows a U-turn and then a move. This allows you to perform a U-turn and then move 1 space, or move 1 space and then perform the U-turn. This leaves us with 1 more card to discuss, but before we do, there's one other rule that we should really learn first. Anytime your mole moves into a space during the game, you add one of your molehill pieces to the same space on the above ground board. If the space that you move into already has a piece there, you instead put your piece on the very bottom. These stacks are called mountains. Now that we understand how this works, let me show you a full example. Anytime that you play a card that would provide you with movement, you first fully complete that movement. So here I would go 1, 2, 3 spaces. Now it's time to place the molehill pieces. When we entered this space, it was empty, so our molehill piece goes here. The next one would go underneath the piece that's already there, and then again here, we'd add 1 to the empty space. The idea is that as a mole moves, it's pushing dirt upwards, turning molehills into mountains. But just keep in mind, when you turn or rotate within the same space, that does not add any pieces to the mountain. You only add pieces to the mountain as your mole enters a new space. I've now set things up as they might look a little later in the game, Just to illustrate that if, while moving, you ever run out of pieces to place, you may first remove molehills of your color from the tops of any mountains until you have enough to complete your movement, or you can take fewer if you like. And if you don't have enough pieces to add to the mountains you moved under, just add as many as you can, placing them in the order that you moved until you run out. So, as you move underground, you're going to be pushing up mountains above ground. And as these mountains grow, you'll want to pay attention because each mountain can only get so high before it topples over. If you look at the score sheet, you'll notice there's a maximum height for the mountains. During the very first round, a mountain can't be higher than 2 pieces tall without toppling, whereas in the 5th round, they can be up to 4 pieces tall. After you finish your move, you check to see if you've created any mountains that exceed the maximum height for that round. Since we're in the first round, which has a maximum height of 2, it means this move has created 2 mountains that now need to topple, and you topple these in the order they're created. So I would have to topple this one first. When you cause a mountain to topple, you decide the direction it will fall in, up, down, left, or right. Let's say we're going to topple it in this direction. The bottommost piece stays in the space that it's in, and then the next bottom piece falls on top of the next pile, and the next bottom piece falls on top of the next pile. And you keep doing this until there's no pieces left. We now have a second mountain that exceeds the maximum height, and that's going to have to topple as well. Here's a little trick you can follow if you want to know where pieces that are toppling are going to land. Let's say this mountain was going to topple in this direction. Take everything but the bottommost piece off of that stack, and then pretend they're laying in this direction across the row. This bottom one would then fall here. This one would go here, and this one would end up on the final spot. If when toppling you ever reach the edge of the board, before placing all of the remaining toppled pieces, just return any extras back to their owner's supplies. Also, it's possible that after you topple a mountain, it will create new mountains that need to topple. If so, resolve those new ones as well. And once any of those newly created toppling mountains have been resolved, go back and continue resolving any topples that had originally been created by the movement card itself. With topple rules understood, we can now learn how this card works when a player reveals it. The mole will stay in its space when this is resolved, so no new pieces will be added above ground. However, this effect represents the mole popping its head above ground for a look, which will cause the mountain directly above it to topple, no matter what height it is, following the usual toppling rules. So with this type of topple, you might even have a really tiny mountain topple on top of a larger one. You can think of it as the mole sticking its head up and just kicking the dirt way up in the air. And again, because it's a topple that you're creating, you decide the direction it falls in. So, now we understand how to resolve any card that's revealed. And after the first player is done, the second player reveals the top card on their stack and resolves it, and so on. Once all the top cards of the player piles have been revealed, they continue taking turns in order, revealing and resolving their next card. And this is why planning your step is so important. Because although you might know what you want to do, the other moles might interfere with your plans as they move around. So during the planning step, you'll want to try and guess what they might do and then plan accordingly. That said, once all of the players have had their cards revealed and resolved, it's time to move to the final step of the round, scoring. Here, each player will check to see which mountains they control, and you control a mountain if your piece is on the very bottom. If so, you control the entire mountain and count each piece within it as a point that you'll add to your score. So red controls this mountain, and it would be worth 2 points. Red also controls this mountain for 2 points, and this one for 2 more points, but gray controls this mountain, and they would gain 2 points. Later in the game, when you're allowed to have higher mountains, you might have a situation like this, and I just want to use this example to drive a point home. Here, the green player controls this entire mountain. It doesn't matter that red has more pieces in it. All that matters is whose piece is on the bottom. So for this, green would score 5 points. After counting all the points you're owed from every mountain you control, add the total to the column under your name for that round. With the scores recorded, all King of the Hill tokens are set back into the middle of the play area, and then you check to see who has the most of their own molehill pieces on the very tops of each of the mountains. And keep in mind, a mountain is also a space with just one piece in it. So in this case, gray has the most pieces on the very tops. That player now gets to pick any one of these tokens that they want to have for the next round. Then the person with the next most pieces on top takes one of the remaining tokens, and so on. If there's ever a tie between players for having the most of their pieces on the upper spots of each of the mountains, then the tie is broken based on the previous turn order. So as an example, let's say there's a tie between the player who had been holding the number 2 token and the player who had been holding the number 3 token. This means the player holding the number 2 token would get to pick one of the remaining tokens first, and then the other player would go. And with the tokens assigned, all of the players discard their movement cards from the previous round into a shared discard pile, and then a new round begins by revealing new cards from the deck. Rounds will continue like this until the end of scoring in the 6th round, where players will total their scores from each round to get a final total, and the player with the most points wins. If there's a tie, the tied player controlling the most 5-piece mountains wins. And if there's still a tie, the tied players compare to see who has the most 4-height mountains. And then, if necessary, they compare their 3-height mountains, and so on until the tie is broken. And if the tie still can't be broken that way, then the tied players share the victory as the top tunnelers. And that's everything you need to know to play Mountains Out of Molehills. If you have any questions about anything you saw here, feel free to put them in the comments below, and I'll gladly answer them as soon as I get a chance. You'll also find forums for discussion, pictures, other videos, and lots more over on the games page at Board Game Geek, and I'll put a link to that in the description below. And if you found this video helpful, please consider giving it a like, subscribing, and clicking that little bell icon so you get notification anytime we post a new video. And if you'd like to support us directly, you can join our Patreon team, which I'll have linked below. But until next time, thanks for watching.